Welcome and thanks everyone for attending our January Democracy and Equity series. Our speaker this evening is Audra Wilson. She's the president and CEO of the Shriver Center for Poverty Law. And she's a lawyer, a policy shaper, a community mobilizer, a teacher, and an executive who has been a champion for racial and economic justice for the last couple of decades, actually. Early in her career, she focused on welfare reform and food security issues in Illinois. She's also served in an advisory capacity to a number of political campaigns, including Barack Obama's, and she was Deputy Chief of Staff for Congressman Robin Kelly. More recently, she was appointed to the Cook County Board by Toni Preckwinkle to chair a Cook County Commission on Women's Issues, and she also serves on the Illinois Commission on Poverty Elimination and Economic Security at the Illinois Commission to End Hunger. And I think most of you know that Audra was also a former director at the League of Women Voters. And so with that, I will turn the conversation over to Audra. We will be, feel free, if you have questions, Audra has offered to leave this very open and much a dialogue. So if you do have questions, by all means, put them in the chat and I'll be happy to share for you. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Kathy. And hello, my league friends. It's good to see so many of you again. I am going to, I'm just pulling up a few of I never go anywhere without my handy dandy stats notes just to sort of ground our conversation, but it's really good. I'm feeling I'm a little grainy right now from my view, so forgive me. Good to just have this conversation, especially at this moment in time as we're talking about gender issues and poverty and that intersection. As Kathy mentioned, I've now been at the Shriver Center for 4.5 years, which is a national anti-poverty organization that works at the intersection of race and poverty, because as we know in the United States, you cannot extricate race from poverty. And so that is where we center our work. And it's actually the first place that I worked when I came out of law school. I worked here for about 4 years before that. I had the opportunity to work as the Deputy Press and Policy Director for then State Senator Barack Obama, who was running for the U.S. Senate. So Shriver holds a special place in my heart, especially as it's a place where I cut my teeth and really began to do a lot of my advocacy as it pertained to low-income working families, and developed my expertise in food stamps and food securities. It was called food stamps at that time. So it's really wonderful to be able to come back and to work in this capacity with all of the lessons that I've learned from my adventures, and just the people that I've met along the way, and of course my experience working as an executive director with the League, which I think was really critical to me being able to transition into this role. So it's just great to be able to come back and talk to you. But obviously there is a lot that is happening as it pertains to low-income working families, and particularly for women who are disproportionately heads of household in low-income communities and low-income families. And so really what I wanted to do is just have a conversation about just where we are right now with respect to the challenges, the unique challenges that women are facing who are living in poverty, and to discuss a few of those challenges as it pertains to women of color, because there's yet another intersection that needs to be elevated, and really kind of what's on the horizon as we were looking at within a few days of the change of administration, and a lot of the rhetoric that you've all been hearing that has been geared towards people who are living in poverty, and the things that are trying to pit communities that are struggling financially and struggling economically against each other, while at the same time enacting some policies that will be stripping away rights and stripping away opportunities and eating away at our social safety net. And so these are things that really do need to be elevated, because it is at the core of the work that you do at the league and making sure that we are sounding the alarm on these very things and these that are happening policy-wise, as well as maneuvering against that. So I just hope to be able to give a little bit of just the backdrop and then open up, like I said, the conversation for more of a discussion. I love this exchange of information, and especially I love being able to come back and talk to league members because I can have a much higher level of conversation with all of you because you're so in the weeds with a lot of these things. And so it ends up being a really great exchange. And so I certainly look forward to getting as much from you as I hope to be able to give you. So with that, let me just give you just a few kind of stats to be able to ground us where we are in this moment to center this conversation. Again, I'm going to give you some stuff that I'm sure many of you already know, but I appreciate you just bearing with me and just minimize myself. So, not a shock that in the United States that there are more women than men who are living in poverty. And when we're talking about the number of people who are living in poverty, which is a little bit over, if we're looking at the official poverty line at about 38.1 million people, 56% of them are women. And we know that in the past few years, especially with the pandemic that had put individuals and families at an increased risk of falling in poverty in the United States, there was a disproportionate impact on women and many women heads of households. Now, during the pandemic, the Congress's emergency unemployment assistance during those first few months made a very big difference. They were able to stave off a predicted spike in the poverty rate. And we know that the policies that were put in place actually helped to cut child poverty significantly. But unfortunately, we have found ourselves very much back in the situation where we were pre-pandemic, with the expiration a lot of the pandemic-related protections. We now are dealing with situations that are even worse because we do have an incoming administration that has been singularly focused on dismantling our social safety net system and limiting access to supportive services for families that are living in poverty. And once again, we are experiencing the disproportionate impact on women. So for some grounding in terms of when we're talking about, I'm going to use a lot of terms. I'm talking about the federal poverty line. I'll be talking about what the official poverty rate is, and then supplemental poverty measure. And so I'd like to define terms so that we're all on the same page. But when you're thinking about the federal poverty line, which we know is a very imperfect measurement of poverty, it's kind of based on an antiquated scale, but at the same time, it is what we continue to use as some sort of measure of poverty. When we're talking about an individual, I think in 2024, the federal poverty line for an individual was at $15,060 a year. A family of two is about $20,440. And a family of four was $31,200. Now, why that's significant is that if we're using this as a measure or a standard of people who are living in poverty, just think for those of you who are living in or close to Chicago. Imagine raising a family of four off of $31,200, that being at the federal poverty line. And now you understand why so many things are indexed so much higher than, up to 100 to 200% of the federal poverty line, because of how exceptionally low that is. And think about the fact of how much it costs, the average for rent, which has been getting higher and higher. Think of the impact of inflation on groceries, the cost of gas, the cost of goods and services, and try to imagine raising a family of four on $31,200 a year. So this is the challenge that we've been dealing with, unfortunately, for generations. Now, the national official poverty rate in this country is around 11%. And that is actually lower than what's considered the supplemental poverty measure, which is 12.9%, and that was by 2023. So the difference, there are two poverty measures that they provide very distinct indicators of our U.S. economic well-being. But the reason why we like to use the supplemental poverty measure is because It accounts for government programs that are designed to assist low-income families that are not included in the official poverty measure. And it also includes federal and state taxes and necessary expenses. And it is also a better measure because it considers geographic variation in housing costs and housing tenure, meaning if someone rents their own home with or without a mortgage, while the official poverty measure does not. So if you ever see the acronym SPM, or you hear supplemental poverty measure, that is the difference between that and the official poverty rate. Now, when you're thinking about that poverty line, it is still an important measure of economic insecurity, and it's still very widely used to determine eligibility for many of these public assistance programs. But as I was mentioning before, it is narrow, it's outdated. And so that's why as advocates, we very much push for the SPM. Now, with that said, let's look at some of the facts about women who are living in poverty specifically. So, women, again, experience higher rates of poverty in men. So more than 1 in 10 women that are age 18 or over, and that's over 14 million, lived in poverty in 2023. And usually when you're looking at the compilation of statistics, we're about a year behind. Poverty rates were especially high for Black women, which is nearly 17%, Latinas, who are a little over 16%, and Native women were at over 20%. So again, more than 1 in 10 women age 18 or older overall were living in poverty. Now, nearly 1 in 3, so over 31% of families headed by single women with children were also considered poor, according to this official poverty line. So you can already see just the disproportionate impact that women in poverty are experiencing, and especially women of color. Those are national statistics, but let's talk a little bit about Illinois. In Illinois, if you're breaking it down by race, ethnicity, and age, you have about 30% or nearly 31% of women who are heads of household in Illinois are living in poverty, again, at the official poverty line. So over 12% of women age 18 or over living in poverty, 22%, actually nearly 23% of women, Black women, almost 14% of Latina women, 10.5% of Asian women, 13.7% of Native women, and 9.3% of white women in Illinois are living officially in poverty. In Illinois, also, almost 15% of children are living in poverty, and nearly 12% of women over the age of 65 are living in poverty. So these, again, are some pretty jarring statistics as you comparing with women with men, and this is actually, these data sets are really very important, because many times when we're thinking about creating poverty, or when we're doing poverty advocacy, and we're looking at whether it's legislation or policies to be able to help counteract poverty, we're not always taking into consideration some of the unique challenges that are faced based off of race, gender, and age. And so that's why it's really very important to disaggregate this data about people who are living in poverty, because then it's easier for us to really analyze what are some of the other factors that are impacting these particular communities that are disproportionately impacted. Now, we know that poverty rates for women and men during childhood tend to be even, but as I just mentioned, they start to widen by the time they reach 18, and especially during prime childbearing years, and then again for women who are over the age of 65. As it pertains to people with disabilities, and particularly women with disabilities, the latest statistic I found in 2022, there were over 26% of disabled women were living in poverty, as compared to 10.7% of non-disabled women and 21% of disabled men. So the question is, why are more women living in poverty? And in particular, why are more women of color living in poverty? Not a shock to all of you who are here, but this is because of the effects of sexism and racism on institutional structures and across the society. And these effects limit employment opportunities that are available to women. We also look at the availability of caregiving support. We look at access to public social assistance programs and more, leading to higher rates of poverty among women, and particularly women of color, as compared to men. Now, some of the many things that LEAP members focus on and raising awareness of have included, for example, the gender gap, wage gap. As you know, on average, women earn less than men, and wage gaps are even wider for most women of color. So as of last year, when you were looking at full-time year-round workers, women were earning about 83 cents for every dollar earned by men, and that's overarchingly, it's including women of color. And of all workers, women were earning about 75 cents for every dollar earned by men. And for part-time workers, women were earning 78 cents for every dollar worked by men. And among women of color and women with disabilities, the disparities were even greater. And a really curious thing when I talk to folks about stats and figures, and we tend to focus a lot on lower wage or moderately income women, but even among highest paying occupations, many women in management, business, and in financial operations still are earning less than men in the same occupations. So these disparities are not limited to low-wage working women. We unfortunately are seeing this across all sectors. And this gender pay gap has stalled for about 20 years, despite the fact that women have been making gains in high earning industries and C-suite representation. And again, you'll hear me say over and over that the gap is even greater for women of color. But not only are women struggling more than men to cover everyday expenses due to this gender wage gap, but this gap compounds over a lifetime, which means that women end up with fewer resources and savings than men. So when we're looking over the lifetime, by the time you have a woman who's over the age of 65 in comparison to how in her savings compared to a man, that's where you see very significant differences. And that gender wage gap is driven by many factors that could be differences in jobs or industries, in hours, and also the types of work that women traditionally have been directed more into that tend to be lower paying, and many other factors. Now, related to the gender pay gap is a gender wealth gap. And at the Shriver Center, we really have been moving more to talking about wealth. We tend to speak about wages, and obviously our primary concern is to make sure that the families and the individuals that we represent are making a living wage. They're able to sustain their families. And so we're always pushing and initiating efforts to be able to raise that wage. But when I started a few years ago, I would have conversations with folks, and I noticed that we were so focused on wage, and then you would have situations where families were still feeling as though they were struggling, families that still were not able to be able to pass down generational wealth, were not able to access generational wealth when it came to purchasing homes or other things like their white counterparts. And so I really wanted to change a lot of the conversation internally to say, hey, can we broaden our focus and not just be thinking about in terms of like the fight for 15 or living wage, as important as it is, but to put it in a much broader context and really address this wealth gap. So as I mentioned before, women are less likely to have the equivalent amount of savings and wealth to provide for themselves and their families throughout their lifetime, especially as compared to men. And similar to the pay gap, this is informed by many factors, including the fact that women earn less than men on average. They are more likely to be denied mortgages and to be overcharged for them. They tend to be particularly vulnerable to predatory lending. They tend to hold more debt, and they also face other obstacles that undermine their ability to build wealth and savings. And again, you'll hear this refrain, you'll see this even greater measure for women who are women of color. when you overlay a lot of the historic discrimination and systems that have been erected to marginalize people of color and really prevent the just the accrual, let alone the transfer of wealth. Something else I may have mentioned earlier too was when you're looking at low wage work, is that there's also occupational segregation. So we know that women are disproportionately represented in certain occupations, especially in low wage jobs, due to pervasive gender roles, expectation that women's work is low skilled, and the systemic undervaluing of women's labor. And once again, you're seeing this especially among women of color. In many of the conversations that I have with my peers, and we start talking about skilled labor, unskilled labor, after my conversations, I made basically a proclamation to my organization that we were not going to use that term of art about skilled and unskilled. And because I think that creates a lot of the challenges that we have right now, the notion that somehow low wage work is unskilled work is very problematic because it justifies a lot of the discrimination that we see. It justifies the paying lower wages because we do not value that sort of work. But anything for which people are receiving money is skilled. It may be a matter of the level of skill that's needed, but even just the lexicon that we use, we have to be very mindful of to not talk about things being unskilled because automatically that shuts down conversation about value and worth and really looking to make sure that people are being paid a wage that allows them to not just subsist, but to actually survive and thrive. Another thing that I know League members have explored and thought about and heard about as it pertains to women in the workforce and making sure that they are supported is a lack of supportive work-family policies to manage work and caregiving. The United States generally lacks supportive work-family policies, like adequate funding for childcare, national paid family and medical leave, and in Illinois, we're fortunate to now have our paid time off, and to think of how hard we had to work as advocates in our coalitions to have paid time off in Illinois, and the resistance that we were getting from the restaurant industry and others to being able to have that time off. It's just a travesty. And that Illinois is one of, there might be more right now, but at the time this was passed last year, was only 14 other states that had official paid time off on the books. Now, childcare still continues to be a challenge, and finding reliable, affordable childcare. And this really can impede a parent's ability to participate in the labor force, and it causes lower employment among mothers as compared to fathers.
Audra,
And
can
yeah,
I interrupt with a quick question for
yeah,
you? And there are a couple here, but I'm gonna wait on a few of these. But
yeah.
do you perceive that things like childcare, as an example, family leave, those sorts of things are not being adequately funded because there's an expectation that women will just then do that work? Or is there some other driver, either societally or financially, that is a barrier to having those kinds of things funded?
No, that's a really good question. I think it's really a combination of both. Because one of the things I like to do is whenever I'm doing my research, I'm not even just looking at stats and figures that pertain to the country and then within our state. I like to compare where we are in the United States with our peer nations, especially if you're looking among those top 25 GDP countries. I actually wrote the first chapter of a book. It was a book for sustainable development goals that we hear a lot about sustainable development goals for the United Nations, and we think about other countries, but this was a book that was applying the United Nations sustainable development goals to the United States, which is something we don't like to do. So the chapter that I wrote was about how do we basically end poverty. It was funny. I joke when I say how do we end poverty in 4,000 words, including footnotes. But part of that was a comparison that we were doing with other countries and to see how much of an outlier we are among developed countries in failing to guarantee access to paid family and medical leave and paid sick leave. So if you look at other countries, and not even necessarily the top 25 countries with GDP, you'll see other, like if you kind of go down the list, countries that provide these social services for their citizens, men and women, people, much more vacation time, much more government support of workers. And this is, in comparison to the United States, it's terrible. So there are so many factors that I think contribute to this. And as I try to dissect these too, I mean, I look, a lot of it, I do think, to be very honest with you, is rooted in racism. Because you're talking about poverty policies that were enacted to differentiate how we treat people of color, and particularly we're looking at freed slaves. So if any of you have done any work with about tip wages, and you've learned about the history of tip wages, you'll learn that the culture of tipping actually came specifically to the United States, and there's reliance upon tips to be able to pay people when you had black servers in the restaurant industry, for whom when tips were supposed to be something that was just for extra service. I mean, it was just you were paid wages according to however you were paid wages. But having black workers that were having to rely upon the tips to actually to sustain themselves, as compared to white service workers. And so this even the history of tip wages has kind of its own racist origins. And so you see a lot of these kind of policies that were put in place really had racial overtones there. And now you see how they play out contemporarily. So there's a bunch of different factors as to why we're experiencing this. But I think, again, if you're looking comparatively, the United States has been lagging behind so many of its peer countries in the protections that it provides. And it uses as an excuse expenses, the cost to budgets. Or now the push has been saying, well, this is something that states should be able to determine based upon their budgets, what they can and cannot supply to their citizens. And that's the effort that's underway right now with the incoming administration, saying, like, for example, cuts to Medicaid. Cuts to Medicaid are not popular if you talk about cutting Medicaid, knowing the number of families that are reliant upon Medicaid that transcend race and ethnicity. So we don't talk about cuts to Medicaid as the program itself, but we talk about the need to what do they say, to reduce wasteful spending is the new term of art, and to allow states to be able to determine how they're able to make expenditures. So through TANF, through Medicaid spending, whatever the case, so states can determine what they need for their citizens. But do understand that that is complete subterfuge, right? Because the fact of the matter is, this is not about wasteful spending. This is a matter of that you want to start cutting these sorts of programs that are more popular, transcending race. So since you can't attack them directly, you do things to be able to say, well, we're cutting wasteful spending, we're allowing states now to be able to step in and to administer these programs, and that's the way to get around them. But other things as it pertains to minimum wage and tip workers and service industry, that is something where we've seen how those programs why we've have a sub-minimum wage, how that has existed historically. And we're making these efforts to counteract that's the sub-minimum wage, and to really just call attention to how we even came to have a country with a sub-minimum wage, which, by the way, you're not looking at any other country with such a thing and such a concept. So it's my very circuitous way of telling you that there's a lot of factors that are kind of put us in the situation we're in right now. But that's why you can't extricate race from this, because some of the very policies that we're talking about that have been enacted specifically to be able to marginalize certain groups of people within this country. But the irony is, at the end of the day, the attempts to marginalize certain people have actually collectively pulled down all Americans. And that is why we're still struggling, why we don't have universal health care, why we don't have a lot of the same protections as we see with our peer countries. And so that is that intersection of race and policies that have been put in place.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Before I have you move on to take a look at like some of the stuff that's being done.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions rather than
Yeah.
wait till the end, if you don't mind if I ask a few. There are several folks that are asking if you wouldn't mind sharing the sources of some of your
Absolutely.
information. I think they'd love to be able to get their hands on it and do a little research on their own.
Love
And
to.
then also uh, trying to understand, aside from your organization, what other gender equity organizations are you working with or aware of who are also working on these kind of equity and poverty issues.
Yes, definitely. Let me pull up a few things for you. So some of the initial statistics that I was giving you comes from the National Women's Law Center. So if it's nwlc.org. So they give overall statistics for women, and then they actually have broken down by state. So that's a really very helpful resource. So the National Women's Law Center. And a lot of the other information that I'm pulling up is actually census data.
Okay.
So very easy to find. As far as organizations that are working on these gender-based issues, there are many. Some of the ones with whom you'll be familiar would be a Women Employed, for example, which is actually a close kind of ally of the Shriver Center, and actually just recently moved into our space, so we're actually physically
Oh, they did.
sharing the
They
same
did.
space. We're very excited about that. Sharita Ellens is the head of Women Employed, and just really dynamic groups.
Sure, Amelia's going to be doing a session for us in March.
Oh, good. She's awesome. She's awesome. She's going to really be able to break down a lot of what I'm saying very specifically, and talk about the work that they're doing. So they are partners of ours. Um, but in addition to Women Employed, we do a lot of work with our peer organizations that do, even those that aren't focusing exclusively on women, but they are very much centering women in their data sets. So we do work with the Chicago Urban League. We do work with Start Early, a lot of our early childhood organizations. We do a lot of work in coalition with the Illinois Commission, Coalition on Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Just sort of a host, and I can actually send you all a kind of a list of some of our peer organizations with whom we work very closely, that some are gender specific, but many of them, though, actually not many of them, all of us do internally in our work disaggregate our information to talk about what sort of impact women are, the impact that these policies have on women specifically, in addition to some organizations like a Women Employed that work very much Chicago Women in Trade. I'm trying to get them all in my head at the same time, that are working very specifically about women in certain sectors, policy issues that are impacting women. So centering on impacting women is happening across all of our advocacy groups. But as we're talking some more, I'll send you some more of our coalition partners too, so you can kind of see some of those folks who you should actually be reaching out to as league members and as resources. There was other questions too, right?
I think that was sort of, I'm sort of paraphrasing most of them
Okay.
together. Um, yeah, I think most of them were in that neighborhood.
Okay.
So yeah, if you're welcome to continue your other train of thought before I interrupt you.
Yeah. No worries. What I want to do though, because it's easy to start to, I am a wonk. So, it's fun to start quoting numbers and statistics because I use it as the basis of, a lot of my conversations. But I think what's really more relevant for all of you now, and this is where it'd be great to just sort of open this up, is knowing these things, because again, I'm telling you things that many of you already know. What does this mean for what's coming next, right? And how have policy organizations been preparing themselves for a change in administration? One of the questions that I get asked really frequently, especially as we're getting closer to the inauguration, is, "Hey, what's going to happen, with the new administration? What are you doing as an organization to prepare yourself? What are you hearing on the ground?" And so the way that I answer that is to say, like, listen, we have been monitoring things that are happening for the last couple of years, because this is the change in administration. That's not sort of the turning point for this. It's all the things that have been happening in the years leading up to the presidential election. It's all the sort of the maneuvering that had been happening in these last 4 years, especially as we saw kind of the ramp up kind of leading up towards the election and the former president that was going to be basically running again. So there has been movement underway for years. And policy organizations will tell you that we've been monitoring this for a long time. Now, did we have sort of a plan A and a plan B depending upon the outcome of the election? Sure, as many people did. But I don't want anyone to think that this, we're caught by surprise. And the reason why I keep mentioning that is because there are many policy organizations that are starting to coalesce and have these conversations to talk about how we are going to maneuver with an incoming administration. But if you speak to any one of us individually, there will be not a single person that has said that there's anything that is surprising them, that is shocking them, that that took them, by surprise. And what I like to point out to people is that when you put out your playbook, your Project 2025 blueprint on exactly what you are about to do to dismantle, a lot of our structures, particularly those that are impacting families living in poverty, taking away reproductive freedoms. I mean, you have an entire playbook that was put out for months and months. So there is nothing that is new that we don't anticipate. The challenge that we have, though, as advocates, though, is sort of where is it going to begin, and how do we position ourselves? Many of the things that are being threatened are things that can't happen with an administrative action. They are going to take legislative action. They are things that are going to end up in court. There are going to be these prolonged fights. But a lot of the bluster and the rhetoric is scaring some advocates already. Case in point, I've had so many conversations with my colleagues about attacks on DEI. And it was one thing when it started with, anti-woke this, anti-woke that, and trying to sort of to dismantle DEI, to talk about it as some sort of, exclusionary sort of policies against white people. And, so this weaponizing of DEI, that rhetoric started a long time ago. But what has also been happening in the last couple of years are these efforts basically threatening whether it's corporations, educational institutions, legal service corporation, which has already endured, from 1996, severe cuts to the way that it does its advocacy. Anything where federal funds are coming in to now, the threat has been that if you are doing anything that is considered woke, anything that is, DEI focused, and they're broadening us to just almost racial justice generally, that you could be defunded, you can lose these sort of supports. Just the threat of that, not even the legality of it, but the threat of that has caused or begun a sort of chilling effect that we're starting to see among organizations, particularly those who center in race, ethnicity, and that intersection. So as a head of one of those organizations, I've had many of my colleagues, I've even had my own staff say, hey, listen, do we have to retool the way that we do our work? Can we speak as freely about, doing this work centering race and ethnicity? Are these things that we should be considering or worrying about? Could we find ourselves being sued because of this? So what we have been doing as advocates, as we coalesce, is to try to meet to calm each other down, to remind ourselves, particularly those of us who are lawyers, to say, wait a minute. What are the things that the administration actually can do, notwithstanding the threats that it makes? What are the legislative actions that it will take? What are the acts of, acts of Congress that it'll take? How do we shore up our litigators to be able to defend against some of the things that the incoming administration is threatening, but not to sort of freak out already and start to edit ourselves and say, well, we're going to stop doing certain kinds of advocacy. We're going to stop doing certain kinds of work because of that threat. So it is a fine line. There's a balance that we have to strike. But those are part of the conversations that we're having right now. But it's really important to center that because we see what's going to be happening and we see where the focus is going to be. So we are looking a lot at immigration, obviously, because one of those initial threats has been talking about mass deportation, which we know logistically, practically is unlikely to happen, but it doesn't mean that you don't take your foot off the gas pedal. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be attempts. And so as advocates, that's one of those spaces in which we are mobilizing and preparing ourselves. You also may have heard that some sources saying that according to the incoming administration, when it comes to this deportation and focusing on undocumented immigrants, that Chicago would be ground zero. Whether that's just bluster, just an idle threat, it's not, we don't take it lightly, but at the same time, we're trying to be more proactive and not so reactionary. Another space that I look at, obviously, with the nature of the work that I do, is the dismantling of the social safety net. And so that pertains more to this conversation. The incoming administration has been very clear in the things that it wants to do to dismantle that social safety net. It wants to reduce the number of participants in Medicaid. It wants to reduce the number of participants in SNAP, receiving SNAP. It wants to limit those who are living above the poverty line from receiving SNAP overall. So we're limiting it only to those at or below the official poverty line, which is why I center this conversation about understanding what does it mean to actually live at the poverty line and how arbitrary that is. Because while there are, we talked about the 38 million people who are living at the poverty line, there are another 45 million people who are living just above. So imagine if you combine those two, you're getting close to a third of the citizens in the United States who are living a paycheck or two away from financial ruin. But to think that there are efforts underway to limit the participation of individuals in these categorical eligibility programs is really problematic. What is also worse, and which is why I talk about the intersectionality of race, is that you've seen in the incoming administration trying to pit white working class, which, by the way, if you ever ask who's in the white working class, it's never clearly defined, but yet you have people who are reacting white working class is sort of self-selected that I'm part of that class. It's by design. It's using race to be able to pit communities against each other. But the irony is all of these cuts that are being made are going to impact even the very people who you purport to be representing, the white working class, because they too are dependent upon SNAP and Medicaid and and many other programs that have been put in place to support income supports for low to moderate income families. So what we are trying to do as advocates is just to sound the alarm and call attention to the very things that the incoming administration is trying to do, and to make sure that we are talking about how we coalesce across lines of race and ethnicity, as opposed to being pitted against each other, pitting immigrants against non-immigrants, or against citizens, pitting one group of working class people against another. That is the strategy that's underway, and it's unfortunately, at least preliminarily, has been working in a sense that it's scaring folks into preemptively changing how they are operating, what they are doing, in anticipation of some sort of blowback from the administration, whether or not it's actually realistic that they're going to be able to do the things that they've threatened.
What are you hearing from people you work with in Illinois as to what Illinois, from a policy perspective or legislative perspective, might be doing to either soften the blow or preempt some of the actions that could be coming our way?
So that's an interesting question, because there's been a lot of lying in wait for a lot of policy organizations, just looking at the state of Illinois, because Illinois is trying to, they're watching to see things that, many of the things for which they would be reliant upon federal funds are up in the air right now. And so long as those things are up in the air in terms of, our program's going to be cut, our federal dollars going to be cut that would be used to otherwise fund a lot of the programs and the initiatives that we advocate for, until that is a clearer sense of what is going to be coming down the pipeline, we've noticed that there's been sort of a delay in the clear sort of development of kind of what are the policy agendas or initiatives are going to be for the governor's office, and subsequently for us as we're, which bills are we promoting, what are we monitoring, what are we pushing forward. The reason why it's so important to know that is because to the extent that we are pushing for initiatives that we know are contingent upon at least partially being paid or funded by federal dollars, we now have to be able to come up with an alternate way to be able to pay for these things to the extent that we think that they're so important that we should still be pushing them. But so all of us are kind of in this weird state of observing and watching to see what happens.
Well, I'm
So
glad to hear we're not the only ones.
no, 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 no. It's it's very unnerving because even as we're sitting at these table with policymakers, advocacy groups, we're all kind of staring at each other like, well, how do we maneuver? So really now what we're trying to shift our focus is, or at least I'll speak for the Shriver Center. We're almost coming from a place of not presuming that certain monies that we expect would come will be there. So what is our plan B? If we're not able to rely upon, funds coming from here, do we pare back? Are there other places that we might be looking? How do we how do we retool some of the policies that we're talking about? Where are we going to find, is it public-private partnerships? Where are some of the things that where do we go to be able to offset monies that we anticipate being lost in coming from cuts from the feds? But it is a little bit of lying in wait for everybody because what's going to happen, what's going to be the first priority of the administration when it comes in. Some of you may have actually read something, I believe it was in the Trib or the Sun Times, even talking about the NEA, so the National Endowment for the Arts, and the grants that Illinois usually receives for artists and residents, that sort of thing. They're also concerned, like, do we move forward with this program? Because is this one of the things that will be on the chopping block? Will there be funds cut towards the arts? And knowing that you have an incoming administration that has some hostility towards our home state, and in particular the city of Chicago, do we need to be concerned about that? This is, the word unprecedented tends to get overused, but I will use it in this context. Never, certainly, I think not in my lifetime, and I suspect many of yours, have we dealt with an administration that has had such open hostility towards particular swaths of people, cities, industries, like, and an antipathy towards so many things that you have to actually worry, will we be caught in the crosshairs, so to speak? It's a ridiculous thing that we have to be actually thinking about, but unfortunately it is the thing that makes us have to sort of hold our breath for a second and be prepared to respond, even though we may not be able to fine tune exactly where our priorities are going to be. I do want to just emphasize one thing that I had mentioned before. To the extent that many of the things that are being proposed are things that have to be done with congressional action and things that will be contested, via litigation. What we are doing, at least in the legal front, is we are working to make sure that our lawyers are ready to basically to fight. So we do what's called affirmative litigation training. So for those who have not done complex litigation or federal litigation, especially with newer, younger lawyers who have not, had that experience, we are starting to provide trainings to prepare them, because we know that when some of these administrative actions that the incoming administration will take, many of the things that they try to put like in place that really they can't do unilaterally, lawyers are going to be ready to sort of jump and pounce all over that to do defense work. So that is something that is, the defense work concept is a groundswell, legal defense, across the country. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well, because we're not just sitting here twiddling our thumbs, we're just waiting for stuff to happen, but we're sort of preparing ourselves to be responsive to whatever comes first. So yeah, I wish I had something more optimistic to tell folks, but that's kind of how we are maneuvering right now.
And as policy organizations, a lot of us fall into that kind of waiting to see or we're advocating for what we know or what have you. Are you hearing any, and I suppose fear plays into this in some regard, but are you hearing of any sort of pulling together on a grassroots level to voice dissatisfaction on the part of women, people of color in general, what have you? I'm curious as to what you might be seeing out there that isn't policy, but more personal, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Um, I'm trying to take off my policy hat for a second because obviously I work so closely with peer organizations that are coalescing around this. I'm I'm hearing, but this is a bit more anecdotally. I'm hearing a lot of chatter over just these groups generally starting to to form or to coalesce. But I think it's a little early for that right now. Like, when I say early for that, not that it's too early to be coalescing, but I'm not sure in the conversations that I've had, and this part of this conversation is very anecdotal. I'm just telling you kind of what I'm hearing. I don't know if people understand the gravity of kind of what is about to happen. I think that there's a lot of, as you know, unfortunately, there were very significant numbers of women and people of color that participated in the election, and and they were motivated to cast their votes off of what they believed was to be the truth about, the impact that the incoming administration would have on the economy, and making the economy stronger. Um, and obviously there are other single issue voters as well, but it's interesting when you talk to some of these folks who really feel like, well, this is not, I don't necessarily like this person coming in, but I think that the challenges that we're having with the economy, the challenges that we have with inflation, the things that we're seeing right now, it seems like it might be in a better position to be able to address that. All of this is to say that you're dealing with individuals who have actually cast their ballots that may possibly be against their own self-interests because of how things have been, couched, for what they're voting for. So I spend as much time having to explain to people, like, do you really actually understand what we're talking about, what the state of the economy is currently? Do you understand that, fixing inflation, if that could have been something that a single president could do, why would that not have been done by now? Do you understand that there are global forces and other things that are at play that have a direct impact on some of the economic challenges that we're facing right now? Because, you know, we're not an island unto ourselves. But that rhetoric, right, the narrative is pretty powerful, powerful enough to convince some folks, of things that we know as advocates are not, in fact, the case. So that's why I say that it's not that I don't think that there are those who are kind of cowering in fear and concerned, but I don't know if I'm seeing or hearing the groundswell as yet, and from non-advocates and advocacy organizations. I'm not sure if people have, it's kind of sunk in what we're about to experience. Do I think in a short period of time you're going to start to see that? Absolutely. And the reason why you're going to start to see that is because some of the promises that were made were absolutely untenable. They were ridiculous. Um, and you're starting to see some of the kind of rolling back on things that were promised in the campaign already, because we know that's just legally, administratively, just not possible. So I think you're going to start to see more of that in the months to come. But right now, where I'm seeing the alarm being sounded, um, um, is among advocates who have been watching this for years and trying to maneuver accordingly. And I think people will sort of, unfortunately, people will follow a little bit later.
Yeah, I don't see any questions. I'm just going to keep asking you questions I have. I am curious about how, you talked a little bit about DEI efforts,
Mhm.
right? And I think most of our advocacy organizations are continuing on our path,
Yes.
right? Not being, threatened by any other possibilities. But I'm wondering if there is, in terms of like employers or other groups, foundations, things of that nature that we count on for grants or, as I said, employment and that sort of thing. Are there strategies that you're looking at that are more educational in nature that help better describe what DEI is and what it is not,
Oh,
to help sort of frame the issues in a way that are helpful to our cause, regardless of what other noise might be out there?
yeah. Now, that's a tough question because that is a place where I would say, unfortunately, advocates have really lost the narrative, the narrative battle. They have not fought against, in my estimation, did not do a very good job in counteracting those narratives. And so now it's become this very amorphous field of like DEI. So DEI has been weaponized. It automatically means, inferiority. It means preferential treatment. DEI now has the same status as, remember the word quotas did,
Right.
from a few decades ago. I mean, it's now
Yeah,
in that
they've been
same
made
category.
synonymous, right?
Absolutely. So, um, and even more disturbingly when we're thinking about wokeness. I mean, if you're looking at the governor of Florida when we're talking about anti-woke, these woke policies, when you're actually trying to codify in law the word woke, like anti-woke, but you don't define what that means. It's very amorphous. That's by design, of course, because now anything can fall and to fit underneath there. So I think a lot of that narrative, unfortunately, is what permeates right now. And so you have companies that are just reflexively, you know, reacting to that, responding to that. A couple of things I would say in response to that. There are, so if I'm speaking from about a company, that is not concerned about, you know, let me back up for a second. From a legal perspective or standpoint, I think that, you know, it's not going to be difficult or as difficult as people worry for a company to be able to say why it has certain practices and things and procedures that are in place to be able to support, and to encourage a diverse workplace because it can transcend race and ethnicity. So I've seen some strategies to broaden, to basically encompass DEI without calling it DEI. I personally am very resentful that we have to run away from these terms, but I understand what they're trying to do. And so that's definitely happening. I think that the there is backlash against some of these attacks, the anti-woke and DEI attacks, and there are some, at least from a company perspective, where they're only beholden to shareholders that they are saying like, no, we're not going to kowtow to anybody, administration or otherwise, about these efforts that we as private corporations or others, can do to support DEI. So I don't think people should be running for the hills, necessarily when they want to reaffirm their support, for the promotion of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I do think that there are things that are happening to broaden the discussion and the conversation about them that don't use maybe the buzzwords so that it's not calling attention,
Okay.
to those sorts of efforts. And I think that's going
Well,
to be really important.
we're coming up on the hour here, but I do have a question. In terms of being able to support either low income slash low wealth women, especially across our state. Are there actions that individuals can take, I guess, in order to whether or not we have some changes coming our way? The problem has been in place for some time and is likely to persist
Yeah.
under any administration, right? And so what can we be doing?
The biggest thing I would say as leaguers you can be doing is something you may already be doing. Not may, I'm sure you're already doing, but you can do even more of. And that is information. The dissemination of information, the elevation, the really defining the narrowly the challenges that are experienced and uplifting the challenges that women are experiencing with limited income. Um, I can't tell you how important that is, especially when I speak to policymakers. Um, Many of you know, especially when I was ED of the league, I come from working with at the House of Representatives. I happen to work for a member of Congress who, obviously it's her policies and things were in line certainly with my own, but when I would talk to a lot of her colleagues and her peers, I was really amazed at how many conversations I would have with some of her colleagues who didn't seem to understand some of the very policies that they were putting forth, how they were disproportionately impacting people in their own communities, because they were again
Wow.
drawn by race. We focus on this group or that group, and we're not looking to see like, well, don't aren't these some of the people that I represent in my own congressional district? So I would always tell advocacy groups that when you are speaking with your policymakers, lawmakers, no matter what your political persuasion is, always understand the demographics of the people who are in your congressional district. Talk about how any of the policies that you are here in support of or against impact these specific groups of individuals.
Great idea.
Let that be the ammunition that you give the lawmaker, policymaker, because then it's a lot harder for them to cast a vote for or against something when they know that, wait, there's entire swaths of my demographic that are going to be impacted positively or negatively by this. So that's a really important thing to do. League members with the information that you have and being able to supply that to policymakers to disaggregate this data, to talk about what is the impact that it's had on, with women of certain backgrounds, whether you by race, women with disabilities, however you disaggregate data, I would say that's going to be really very important, especially for policymakers who rely upon that information as they're determining kind of how best to move forward.
Yeah, thanks for that insight. Yeah.
And engage, and you have to really engaging at a local league level with a lot of faith institutions, um, and other sorts of community sort of providers that are working with these populations, could so much use with the help that the league members are able to provide and information, but they are just as much a resource to you as you are to them. So when you're approaching, whoever is in your community, to identify like who are some of the folks who are working most directly with some of the communities of color, communities that are more economically disadvantaged within. Be able to identify them first and foremost. Identify yourself as a league member and talk about the resources that you can provide and to be in the way that you're being of assistance. But start that conversation with them to say, hey, we could use, what is some more information that you need, that we should be knowing about how we can now elevate some of the challenges that you're experiencing. How can we be a conduit to be able to talk to lawmakers and policymakers? And I think that's just a really great way league members can make themselves as useful to the communities that they serve, as much as you can glean from directly from the communities the challenges that they're experiencing, and those challenges that you hear about you can now incorporate more into the policy recommendations that you are making for lawmakers at different levels. So opening those lines of communication, I think, are going to be important. Being a conduit and having information flowing both ways is going to be important, and understand that it is, I don't care where you sit in whatever local league, you have to know, you have to do some reconnaissance, know where those resources are. And if you have specific populations, of people of color, of folks that you know are more economically marginalized, never presume that they don't have networks themselves and aren't talking about thinking about these sorts of issues. It's just for you to go and start to ask where that information is. Who are the folks that we need to speak to? Who are the people in the communities that are doing this work? And making sure you're establishing a relationship with them directly. And I think that's going to be of immeasurable help.
Thanks. That's a great insight. I see some heads nodding and some chat info saying that that's really useful information. So much appreciated. Um,
I like the rightful presence. I love
Rightful
that.
presence rather than
I think,
yeah.
that, so even in your individual conversations, and I mean, this, you are highly intelligent, accomplished leaguers and women. I can't impress upon you how you have to, any time you hear this, you've got to neutralize it on the spot in your individual conversations. Remember what I said, told you, even language that I'm changing when I said I don't talk about anything being unskilled. It's, this is not just semantics.
Just
It's,
labels. Yeah, get
these
away from it.
labels, they're stuck in brains, and these labels underscore the policies that are put in place. These labels come from tropes that we have about certain communities and how they live. And I see them all the time in public policy. So the ability to neutralize that, to challenge it, to say, no, no, we don't use that language, and here's the reason why we don't. You can start, as simple as that. And so I love that rightful presence. It's going to be especially important because, people are listening for the buzzwords, but you're 10 steps ahead of them. It's like, okay, fine. You want to play that game? Fine. Let's talk about rightful presence. Because why would we presume that person X or person Y shouldn't be at the table? Turn the tables on them to say, but the presumption is should it be all white? Should it be all male? Should it be all homogenous? Why is diversity suddenly a negative thing? Because the presumption is that, somehow
Someone doesn't belong.
exactly someone just does not belong, and that's ridiculous. So you do have so much power that you wield, and you guys sit in so many different tables, and it's in and are in a lot of these conversations, and you engage so much with your local policymakers and lawmakers, legislators. So it is for you to really counteract that, and don't be afraid. I mean, I'm asking you to be the leaguers that you are, because leaguers are not shy, right? So we're not shy, we're not wallflowers. But it is really important to use your voice collectively and individually to really counteract when you're hearing some of these things and challenge, and to continue to do so. The final thing I'll say about this, and I'm telling you now as a Black woman speaking to a group of predominantly white women, you need to be the voice in the room when I'm not there, right? You're in places and spaces where you will not see people like me. So I need to know that if you are an ally, a true ally, you have to be willing to say the things that I'm telling you in the spaces where either I'm not welcomed or I just wouldn't naturally be. And I will share afterwards the resource list that we have of our peer organizations if you need information or whatever to carry from those organizations into those conversations. Trust me, I've got plenty of those to be able to send to you. But do understand that the power that you wield most as a leaguer is you are in the spaces where people who look like me are not. And how you carry the message, what you say, how you say it, how you counteract it, it's so critical. And it's going to be actually even more powerful than something that I would say. Because, I come into these spaces and of course people are going to say, oh, of course she's going to say that. But when you say it and you're kind of reinforcing and reiterating what I'm saying, it goes so much farther. So please be as true allyship as you need to be that voice of the people who are not in the room.
I will try to remember to quote you on that ask as we talk through the year about various poverty related and equity related policies that we're going to be talking about. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And that works for men too. They got to be
Yeah,
the
yeah.
champion, the voice. If you have brothers, husbands, uncles, whomever, they have to be doing the same thing. Anyone who's not in that room you have to make sure that there's a voice in there that's representing that.
Well, I do want to say one big thank you again for sharing your time with us this evening. Um, I'll let you read all the thank yous and applause if you've got your chat open
I do, and I thank
for
you.
yourself.
And thanks for bearing with me. You guys who know me know I get really wonky, but then I kind of get on a roll. But I have not forgotten. I'm going to share some resources. I'll
Thank
send them
you. And
directly to Kathy
I'll pass those
that you
around.
will distribute.
Yeah,
I will,
absolutely.
including some things that I want you to be reading, like to add to the league's reading list. You are extraordinarily well read, ladies. So I know you've read like Heather McGee, The Sum of Us. Some of you may have come to our poverty summit from last year when we had Professor Matthew Desmond about poverty in America, or poverty by America, excuse me, poverty by America, um, and other things that I'm going to add to your reading list that I would encourage you to looking at carefully. But be the leaguers that you are. You're bold, you are outspoken, and people are relying upon like what does the league have to say and looking to you as a resource. So, and I continue to use you as a resource. So just be who you are.
And please do, and keep us posted as your ear is to the ground. If there's anything that Lee can do to support um, anything that you're hearing about, reach out, reach out.
I definitely
We're
will.
here for it.
And I know we're over time, but just one last thing I want to tell everybody. Monday, obviously, we know is the inauguration. It is not a coincidence that it falls on the King holiday.
Right?
And so I'm actually working on a piece right now for, I think, Salon, to talk a bit about that. But in the conversations that you have, especially within your households, if you're having anything that's within the league, I think it's a perfect opportunity to really to juxtapose the person who we are commemorating right now and the push for economic justice and this incoming administration. So that's going to make a very interesting dinner time conversation for you all. But just to be thinking about that because it is a very curious coincidence. Maybe it's fate. Maybe it was meant to spur this kind of conversation. But use Monday not only as just a day of commemoration of just these wonderful speeches that we all listen to, but look and read carefully about Dr. King's very, very pointed, just blistering sort of critiques on economic injustice in this country and his push for multiracial coalitions that transcend race and ethnicity, but coalescing for people who are living in poverty and economic justice. I can't tell you, that tends to get glossed over. It really does. And you'll listen, you'll never hear him really talking about it sort of in the news and some of these commemorative things. But I'm telling you as league members, because you are agitators, for you to be really uplifting the message of economic justice and read those speeches where he is blasting, he's demanding guaranteed income comes from Dr. King. That's not something new. You guys know that. For where do we go from here? You can read, he literally, the guaranteed income programs that we see contemporarily come from Dr. King calling for that nationally. So I would love for you guys to have conversations about economic justice and his legacy and uplift that as well. Share those resources with everybody you know, and not just the speeches, I have a dream, but find some other stuff that you'll say that is really pretty hard hitting. And that's fun stuff for leaguers. You'll love that.
Very good. I'm sure that knowing what I know about what plans are for the day, I'm sure local leagues already have a few things up their sleeve that are being planned for that at the local level for sure.
Yeah,
So
awesome. Well, thank you, folks. I
thanks,
really
Elaine.
appreciate you inviting me to talk. I'll send more resources along, and consider the Shriver Center and our colleagues. We are resources for League at any time.
Thank you for that.
And my team too. I'm happy to deploy anyone you need from my team too, because they love to talk from health to economic justice issues to child welfare to whatever. We're more than happy to be there to work with you and just to give you a heads up on what we're working on.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks to the rest of you for attending this
Yeah.
evening, and we'll be in touch. Look forward to hearing from you.
Take care, everybody.
Good night.